Next up, we've got Paolo. Where's Paolo? And he's going to be talking about developing Revit plugins with C#.
Good afternoon, everyone. Cork in the room. Yes. How's the day going so far? Having fun? Yeah, nice. Looking forward to some Guinnesses after the dinner. Yeah. Yes. So, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Paolo Modenese, and we're going to give you a brief introduction into how you can create plugins in Revit with C#. I'm an Italo-Ecuadorian licensed architect, author of a book in Ecuador many years ago, and I have around 7 years of experience in this field, and being an architect and transitioning from architect to more like the software development world, it's been really an interesting path. Personally, I've discovered this side of me, the nerd side of me, and I think many of you have it. So this talk is just for those of you who are like curious on how this technology actually works. It is not a tutorial. It's just a brief overview, and by the end of it, I will give you some interesting resources. So if you are interested in this, you can keep on discovering by yourself, and by all means, you will have my contact afterwards, and you just keep on, you just ask me whatever you want, and LinkedIn, we can be LinkedIn friends and anything. So yes, I work for a company called Camilion Consulting and Development. We are based in Barcelona. We do custom integrations for the AEC industry. We work with Revit, AutoCAD, Civil 3D, Forge. We do plugins, and specifically, I am the lead developer for the plugins in Revit. So I talked about this already. It's not a tutorial. It's an overview. OK, so let's start. So many years ago, I was working in Italy in a really cool consultancy called Maffei's Engineering, and there was one day when I learned that you could create your own buttons in Revit. This was unknown to me at the time, and this was my face when I learned that you could create buttons in Revit. Believe it or not, it's not very visible, but yeah, my eyes have changed color. The rest is pretty much the same. And the first question that I had is, how does it actually work? Okay, so this is what I'm here to tell you today, and we're going to break it up in 3 parts. First, some prerequisites that you will need, then the actual steps, and then going forward, stepping stones and some useful resources. Okay, so prerequisites. Not all buttons are the same. Okay, there are many ways to create buttons in Revit. These are the 3 main ones, at least the ones that I know. First one is with PyRevit. PyRevit is a plugin that allows you to create buttons using the Python language. This plugin has been created by Ehsan Iran-Nejad, and he has some really great resources online into understanding the Revit API. And since it's done with Python, Python is an easier to learn language, and it's definitely a recommended stepping stone before going into C#. Then we have Nonica. Mr. Jaime presented his plugin earlier. So similarly, Nonica allows you to create buttons in the Revit API, starting from scripts in Dynamo. And then we have the last way, which is using C#. But not only C#, you can use any .NET compliant language. .NET is a technology from Microsoft, and there are different languages. In the past, VB.NET was the preferred language. Now it's C#, and there are other languages, but so we will focus on C# for this presentation. Good. Once we get that down, so what software do we need to start creating our plugins? We need, obviously, the host software, which in this case is Revit. We need an IDE, which is Visual Studio, and I will talk about this in the next slide. And it is preferable to have some type of code editor like Notepad++. It's like your regular Windows Notepad, but better because you can get some interesting features. It can have some type of IntelliSense and other cool features, and it's open source and it's free, so definitely recommended. And now the second thing that we needed, an IDE. What is an IDE? IDE means Integrated Development Environment. Basically, it's a software that allows programmers to write software. For Microsoft technologies, the preferred solution is Visual Studio. There is a free edition, which is good, and it's what we use. Actually, it's Visual Studio Community. You can just download it and start right away. So basically, an IDE has three main functions. It's a source code editor, where you can get syntax checking and auto-completion. And in this GIF, I don't know if you can see, but it's an example of auto-completion. Basically, you start typing the code, and the software gives you a list of options of what are you trying to achieve. This is super useful at the moment of creating your code, because like Revit APIs, it has, I don't know, thousands of calls. You are not going to memorize them all, but you kind of know where you have to go. So you start typing a letter and you get this list of options. So auto-completion is really necessary, and Visual Studio does this really well. Then you have something called build automation, and we'll get into this in the next slides. And one last thing called debugging. And debugging is the process of going through your code line by line, understanding where the errors are, and fixing them, because this is a big part of software development. It's not just creating the code, it's finding these errors, which you would never have thought existed, because a software can be used in a million ways. And you as a programmer, you think it's going to go this way, but there are 1,000 other paths that are just going to start popping out. So debugging is really important. Okay. Once you have the required software, you need the required skills. So basically, there are 4 main skills you will need to acquire. First one is you will need to learn a little bit about the host application, Revit. Then you need to know the basics of the language, C#. Then you need to know a bit about the API that we are dealing with, which is Revit's API. And the last thing, you need to know a little bit about the IDE, so Visual Studio, so how it works, and where to get, what buttons to click to create your assembly, and I'll talk about this in the next slides. Okay, first of all, Revit API. What is an API? API is an acronym for Application Programming Interface. In simpler terms, it's what software developers use to interact with an existing piece of software. And here I would like to take you to Revit's API, well, to the documentation. You can find this documentation online. And I just want to make a really quick example. Let's say I'm a software developer and I want to create a plugin that when I click the button, it creates some walls. Okay, so I'm gonna just intuitively, I know it exists, but if I didn't, I'm gonna start typing the word wall, and sure enough, there is something here called wall class. Let's click it to see what it makes. So wall class, here it says up. Oh, fuck, sorry. Let me just do this. I think I have to. Sorry, how can I show? Yeah, we're good with time. Yeah. Yeah. Can I show the browser for a second? Yes. Okay, apologies. So again, the documentation for the Revit API is available online. So for example, going back to our example, I want to create a plugin that does something with a wall. So I just type in the word wall, and there is something here called wall class. And it says represents a wall in Autodesk Revit. Okay, amazing. So let's see what things I can do. So all these things that you're seeing here, these are all methods and properties, things that the developer can use in their code to do stuff. And there is a method called create, where there are several methods called create. And specifically, for example, this method is what allows me to create a wall in Revit API. So without getting into the details, someone who knows C# will understand and say, okay, so when I type in the code wall.create, open parentheses, and I give it 3 things, a wall will be created. So this is just a general thing to kind of get you into how it works, yeah? Because some things you will know, some things you will find tutorials, others you won't, so you'll just have to search through the APIs and see if it's possible or not. Okay, I will get back to the presentation now. Interface. Yes. Vale. Okay, so this is about the API. Let's get into the steps. Okay, I'll make it brief. So basically, we have 5 steps. The first one is to create the actual code. In Visual Studio, there is something called Create a Visual Studio Project. You reference the Revit API so that Visual Studio knows what type of code you're trying to create. So when you type wall dot, he will give you a list of things, and among these things, it will be the option create. So you're like, oh, create, bah. And then you start coding and you start debugging. It's just an iterative process until you create your software. See, you're referencing the Revit API, create your code, debug it. And this is actually where most of the job gets done. And I will not get into it, but that's like 70% of it. So once it's created, we have another step called compilation. What does compilation mean? There's a button in Visual Studio, and it says build, and when you click it, all this code becomes something that is known as a DLL. It's a special type of file, and you put this special type of file in a special place, and Revit, when it opens up, it will read this file, and this file, the DLL, this is your plugin. Okay, so this is the main difference. Going back to PyRevit and Nonica, this is the main difference between programming with C# and with PyRevit, for example. This language, you need to compile it, and there are many different technicalities, but just be aware of that. There's 3 minutes, okay. There's one more thing called the add-in manifest, okay? So whenever you are receiving a plugin for Revit, you will have the DLL, which is the actual code, and you will have this thing called add-in manifest, which is just an XML, a text file, with instructions for Revit on where to look for this plugin. So there's one of the lines of code, and Revit, when it's opening, it will look at this add-in manifest and say, okay, I have to look for the DLL here. And like in this case, this is one of our plugins, and it's in line 5. So yeah, and the location is specific. When you go into the documentation, Autodesk people, they tell you, if you want your plugins to be located, you have to put them exactly here. And one of the locations is in Program Data, Autodesk, Revit, Add-ins. Yes, and the last step, rejoice at the sight of your created plugin, very important, okay? Right, and just to finish, I want to give you a couple of stepping stones, which have been my personal experience. So first, I would encourage you to learn Dynamo, which is a great way to understand how automation works. Once you're comfortable with it, you start going into Python. So you can do it directly inside of Dynamo. You have the Python node, and then you can jump into PyRevit, and then you can jump into C#, and then you create your plugins in C#. This presentation, I hope that it will be distributed afterwards, because there are a lot of useful resources with links. So I will not tell you about them right now. Maybe if I just have to point to one of them, it's the last one, archilab.net. The name of the guy is Konrad Sobon. He's like he has really great content, and in his website, in his blog, he has really detailed tutorials on how to create the plugins. Last slide. Let's see if this works. Yes. So we are actively looking for beta testers for the last plugin we've made in Revit. And this plugin is a batch processor for Dynamo. So basically, how does it work? You have one Dynamo script, and you have many Revit files. For example, say that you are doing some maintenance, say a big project, you have 50 Revit files, you are the BIM manager, and you don't want to go every week across all your 50 Revit files and perform some tiny automation task or some big automation task. So you just take all your projects, drop them into the plugin, to drag and drop, and then you just click the execute button, and the plugin will execute this Dynamo script, the one that you chose, across all of your Revit projects or families or templates. So yeah, we're currently testing it, and if you're a Dynamo user and you think this could be interesting to you, please reach out to me. I would love to speak to you and see how you think it could be useful, and you can get many cool features. But yeah, I think this is it. Thank you very much for